At what period are we talking? The height of masculine domesticity?
Well, the height of masculine domesticity means essentially around about 1820 to 1860. As rough dates, I would say. So it's a whole generation. Okay, it's a whole generation in which certain ways of fulfilling the home's material function become more and more set, more and more ritualized. That's what eventually, I think, created problems.
So it's a direct response to industrialization in terms of the time period that we're looking at.
It certainly coincides very, very neatly with them, and is what you're asking, to what extent it's the consequence of industrialization. Is that what you're suggesting? Yeah, I mean, I think that if the urban environment as it had now developed in this time was seen with very, very mixed feelings, this is where you make your money, but it's a nasty place. It's not only materially nasty, it's also seen as morally questionable. What do people have to do in order to make money? Perhaps we better not look too closely. But that whole kind of sense of ambivalence about the way in which capitalism is developing. I mean, that may sound a rather portentous way of putting it, but I do think it's genuine. And so the home is being expected to fulfill all sorts of lacks, absences of what in people's imagination they had more readily in pre-industrial days. It's an open question whether they really did, but that feeling was very, very strong, and it was a reaction against the very mixed feelings they had about the nature of city life.
This drawing away from public life of women and of mothers, is that also a consequence of industrialization, in the sense that industrialization generates the wealth to permit middle class people to do this, that women newly have the luxury of not having to be economically active outside the home?
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. It then threw into relief what exactly is the purpose of a wife who isn't engaged in that kind of productive activity. And if you place that alongside the uncertainty that men felt about the environment, the urban environment they were working in, you put those two together, you have actually the basis of a kind of separate spheres morality, where the wife is responsible not just for her husband's physical comfort, but for actually for moral comfort, for reassuring him, for inviting him to acknowledge that things aren't as they should be in the city. All those things are bound up in her role. And what we have to remember is that this way of thinking about the home, it's conventional to see it as something that women were responsible for. But actually, in a very real sense, it's something that men were responsible for, because that's exactly what they needed. And so, there's a kind of complementarity. I mean, in recent thinking about marriage, complementarity tends to be thought of as a rather dirty word, because precisely because it's saying each party is providing something different for the other one. And we sort of, we shy away from that and thinking, oh, this is separate spheres. Well, maybe it is, but you could see why it had appeal in the 19th century for both husbands and wives in different ways.
Yeah, okay, the marriage question. So this is also the period where we have the idealizing of the companionate marriage, which indeed is, I think, essential to the domestic ideal, the idea that this isn't just an economic arrangement. This is a deeply affectionate relationship. That's how it ought to be.
Yes, that's a very interesting issue, because what's lying beneath the surface of that is, how do marriages handle, on the one hand, that kind of notion about moral comfort and material provision on the one hand, and on the other, the tradition of marital behavior, which of course is one of patriarchy. And you can be quite sure that in the 19th century, plenty of men thought that's what marriage still ought to be about. So there's a real tension going on there. It takes many, many forms. It can be a kind of rather uneasy mixture of patriarchy and companionate marriage. And one could, I do instance examples of that kind in my book. The one that I find most telling is the marriage of Edward and Mary Benson, who got married in the 1850s. And because she was virtually underage. She was only 18 compared with his 30 or 31. She tends to be seen as a child bride and to be treated as an errant child when she was stepping outside what she ought to do. Okay, so there's a patriarchal input there. But on the other hand, there's her feeling that what she owes to her husband is tenderness and care and concern, and he has the nerve to sometimes complain that he doesn't receive enough tenderness. So these concepts are infinitely malleable, as you can imagine, and can arise and can generate as much tension as they do the rather silken idea of a companionate marriage, which we tend to think, quite rightly, in positive terms, as something that might be aimed for. But in trying to apply it, to implement it, all sorts of problems can occur.
We also see at the same time, it's surely strongly linked, as the companionate marriage is being prized, that domestic violence is increasingly vilified. Doesn't mean it doesn't go on.
Indeed,
but that there are changing attitudes towards wife beating, and I guess the license that the patriarch is given in that way.
I think what's happening there is that, without any doubt, the incidence of wife beating and other forms of domestic abuse in the working class is much more visible. Now, whether it's more visible because the incidence is greater, or because it's, to put it crudely, it's a kind of instrument of class warfare, as it were, that they're seen in that light. One thing I think we can say is that in the middle class, domestic violence was not unknown, but to put it very crudely, it tended to carry out instances of brutal assault. I mean, that would be very rare, and we can say that's unlikely because it was in the middle class that the possibility of going to law to deal with these issues was much more, of course, available and accessible. So there are some cases. I mean, the sort of thing that would generate a possibly legal case would be not so much a physical assault, but something like, for example, where the husband insists on taking control of the household and dismissing the servants when that's her job. Things like that might generate a legal case, or a husband who is unfaithful. Obviously, that would be the prime cause. So it would be for different reasons, in a sense, from in working class marriages, but it's certainly a major issue throughout the period that we're looking at.